Hi, my name's Patrick Barron. I'm the Regional Director from the Asia Foundation for Conflict Programs based in Bangkok, a colleague of Silas and George's. Thank you to all of you. One thing that no one really mentioned was electoral rules. And one thing that got me thinking was David's comment about how, yeah, elections kind of give a certain type of legitimacy if your guy wins, right? So, you know, of course, people they think it's legitimate if the people they supported or their tribe or whatever gets into government, which the kind of logic that follows is maybe you need electoral rules that let as many people win as possible, right? And you know, we've got a few mechanisms for that. So one is proportional representation. So basically you don't have winner takes all politics. You have everyone getting at least some piece of the pie. And then the other is decentralization, where essentially even if you don't win at the national level, there's still some resources to use or abuse it at the local level. So I thought it would be interesting to get the reflections of the panelists in their countries as to whether, given the limits to the type of legitimacy we can expect in countries with these types of institutions, whether those types of things would be useful or not.
Thank you. Okay, to keep track. The gentleman, thank you.
Hi, I'm Leo Graham Delart from the Africa Justice Foundation, although my question, I should point out, is more of a personal and academic one. I was just thinking, is the question that you've presented, and certainly in the way that I feel most of the people have addressed it, almost somewhat rigged, not to use that as a pun in the election situation, in the sense that legitimacy, with pretty much all of the panel speakers, has very much been linked to democracy. And is that somewhat Anglo or Western-centric, this idea that legitimacy, as I think somebody did define it properly, is just acceptance of authority by the people, acceptance of political authority? And actually, is that perhaps outdated, or as I said, Anglo-centric? And do we need to perhaps consider more ideas of performance legitimacy? I mean, things like security and economic development were mentioned. But if you think of places like Singapore, where the governments there have focused much more on the delivery by the state as opposed to parties of fundamental services, are those actually, particularly in post-conflict states, more of a priority for people? And so do we need to move away from connecting legitimacy and democracy?
Thank you. I had, and then so we have the two gentlemen with glasses, one at the very back, and then, yeah, and then you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Gareth Wall from the Commonwealth Local Government Forum and the University of Birmingham. I just wanted to pick up on the point of decentralisation. Is there a role in local government elections or local elected government? There was the comment of federalism, the issue of what George brought up in Nepal with the lack of local government. Quite a few people mentioned the role of opposition parties, and certainly your graph that showed what was going on in Cambodia or East Timor, it seemed more interesting what was happening with the opposition parties rather than who was actually winning. So in terms of the role of local governments as a legitimising opposition parties, I don't know. Thanks.
My name is Aziz Ossawi. I come from Sudan. I'd like to pick up the point on Sierra Leone and Liberia and add Ivory Coast to them. I mean, I'm mainly interested in the role which was played by Western intervention in creating the conditions. Oh, sorry. The role of Western intervention. I mean, the United Nations and France and the United Kingdom certainly played a role in creating the conditions which made elections possible in these three countries. I'm asking this because I'm coming from, from a Sudanese perspective. We have actually in Sudan a state of virtual, perpetual conflict in Sudan. You might know, people here might know that part of the country had to separate because of this certain conflicts. Our problem in Sudan is that we don't accept Western intervention. And without that, we will not never get to any kind of democracy, which is African or liberal or anything like that. This has to do, I think, with the mindset of the Arabs and especially Muslim Arabs. This is a very big problem. It might be discussed here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have Delia. I don't know if all of the people asking questions have been footballers, but we will be the first woman to ask a question. So that's
definitely not a footballer. Comment for Claire, which is just when you talk about the Mansfield and Snyder literature, I think that's about elections and international conflict, and it strikes me that the more germane point is about elections and domestic conflicts, so civil war, ethnic conflict, etc. It might not matter, but it's a thought I had when you were talking about it. But the question is really for anybody on the panel, which is we at BBC Media Action often work in fragile states where the state broadcaster is an institution that effectively steps in as a way to build legitimacy with or without elections. And I'd be interested if any of you want to comment on that in your respective countries, whether you think the state broadcaster can be a sort of de facto institution that unites the country with or without elections, or not. David Harris is shaking his head.
I think I will take one more question from the lady in the back, and then I will invite our panelists to try to address some of the comments.
Hello, Ruth Jacobson from the Global Insecurities Centre at the University of Bristol, but formerly in Bradford, so hello to everybody. David, having sort of broken this startling news that elections in various parts of the world are not necessarily run on liberal individualistic patterns, I would just like to raise the gender question, because the absolute one thing that feminist political science has established is how much the Western democratic tradition is embodied in the male citizen. So in terms of the actual research that your project is doing, or in fact the empirical on the ground notions of democracy plus, and which I like the sound of, what role might gender play? I quite accept that it might not. There are lots of instances where it doesn't, but unless one investigates it, how does one know? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, perhaps now I can allow the panel to come in with a few minutes each, and maybe Georgie, we start with you and we move this way. Is that okay? There were lots of different questions about lots of different themes, so you may pick and choose in a democratic fashion what you want to address.
Okay. Thanks, by the way, for telling me this is all public record at the end of my talk. I guess I can't speak to all of these because I don't remember all the questions, but the ones that stuck out for me was pretty much the first question and the last one, and I can speak to those partly because we're working on that. The whole matter of do parties in post-conflict settings have differences in their party ideologies or in their sort of public policy positions? And the answer is no. All of them basically are engaged in these narrow, self-interested ways of just simply perpetuating their sort of capture of the settlement and all that follows. And so one of the challenges we faced both in Afghanistan and in Nepal was to how do we get beyond the euphoria and the hysteria of elections as if once those are done, we are well on our way. Actually, that's just the minimum first step. There are so many other things to be done, including repairing the public policy process, ensuring that garbage isn't going in, or even coming out of the policy process. How do you bring substance back into it? How do you represent citizen preferences in the public policy process and not just elite voice? So the fact that the elites are uniformly engaged in preventing that by virtue of their political settlement. I say preventing because there are enormous costs to overcoming that inertia that I think we frequently underestimate in post-conflict settings. And that really bothers me because people just think that 1 or 2 rounds confer legitimacy. So no, they don't have it. There's a lot of work to be done. I think it'll take as many years as it took to destroy a country to bring that back. In terms of gender, first I'd like to say that the way we are trying to understand it in the Nepal context is well beyond the representation of women in parliament, for example, but trying to look at how society continuously defines the relationship among various members within that community, and how then that translates into outcomes in terms of opportunity, equality, justice, etc. And I would say that the way it's emerged in Nepal has been quite startling. If you say that 50% of society is affected by war or by the lack of peace or the breakdown of peace, well then, shouldn't they be represented in negotiations and in dialogue? And without exception, they're not. And that is a problem. On the other hand, I would also say, ashamedly so, that in 40 years of investing in Asia, we ourselves are complicit in not surfacing women leaders who could actually participate as substantive, thoughtful contributors to dialogue. And I don't mean through the accepted political formations. I just mean in public life. This is something that we've been correcting in the last 3-4 years by targeted sort of interventions at emerging voice and various through considering our investments in, let's say, a gendered framework in development. And again, it's not just about, for me at least, the 30% representation in parliament, which I think misleads people to thinking that means voice and representation and choice.
Thank you. Yeah, a lot of good questions. I'd like to pick up on Patty and the gentleman back here. Just questions about whether or not sort of the political decentralization in a way would help break down some of the issues around sort of conferring legitimacy through elections. As I understood your statement, that you were suggesting that proportional representation in those types of systems somehow would provide better sort of linkages between a citizen and their representative. In the case of Cambodia and Timor-Leste, I think this is sort of contrary to what we see in Timor. The fact that it's a national constituency and proportional representation is problematic. It's how do you get people to even get out of parliament to go and to the SUCO or to the district or sub-district to go see people is sometimes a question, and a lot of people have been scratching their head for a while on that one in Timor. In Cambodia, the issue is that essentially what it looks like is that the political representatives, the members in the National Assembly, are largely beholden to the party in the proportional representation system, and that party discipline rules. So, party list is presented, and whether or not you're on that list depends on your jockeying for position within the party. But the issue of the subnational sort of elections and looking at how to really decentralize, not just administratively or fiscally, but on political decentralization, I think it's a really interesting one. I think it is incredibly problematic from the standpoint of trying to influence key decision makers to do that. The political parties who are in power spend a lot of time concentrating. They're thinking about how to concentrate power, particularly in post-conflict situations. And I think the issue of how do you convince people that political sort of deconcentration is going to benefit them when they're in power is an issue. But I think it's something to explore. We're addressing that in Timor, and I think it's worthwhile drawing on lessons from elsewhere where that's been in place. Just on the BBC media action question and state broadcasting, whether that can help promote legitimacy, was that the question more or less? Or facilitate. There's a great BBC media action program in Cambodia, so I can speak about the role that the important role of putting out, particularly for youth, for educating the citizenry about what citizenship means. I think we oftentimes talk about rights, but also about duties is equally important. And looking at how to do that in a politically repressive environment is it's always treading a fine line, but I think it's an area that is for sure important. It's important in Cambodia. The number of young people that are engaged in listening activities, as well as calling in and youth groups and other things, I think is really impressive. So I would say yes, a plug for BBC Media Action there.
Is our Asia director sitting behind me?
Okay. Yeah, Colin Spurwood is a friend of mine. So.
Claire.
I'd like to have a shot at answering all of them, but if I run out of time, you can punch me, Alina.
No violence at the meeting.
So Paddy, on electoral rules, I didn't get into that in the talk because I was struggling to cope in 10 minutes just with the kind of prerequisites and violence links. But I think that it comes back to the issue of, do all good things come together? Because while different forms of electoral rules like proportional representation or providing for minority rights before elections take place, you know, for example, setting aside a certain number of seats in Parliament or decentralisation, while those can sometimes provide a means for ensuring that there's a wider or more inclusive representation, or potentially legitimacy in other forms than winner-takes-all type electoral processes, you can end up with some difficult situations. And I think Timor provides an example of that, where you've got one party has great representation at the village level, that's Fretilin, and the coalition or the alliance that are in power have good representation at the elite level. So the government won't decentralise, as far as I understand it, although this is not publicly acknowledged, but they won't decentralise because that means they'll lose power, because they won't be the ones who get elected at the decentralised level. So you'd end up with a state quite split within itself. So you can see the rationale for slowing down decentralisation, even if that would engender greater representation for villagers. What would it mean for the state at the central level? It wouldn't be a cohesive, stable system. There'd be a lot of tensions there. So I guess the idea of decentralisation would be greater representation and inclusivity, but it might affect a fragile state in ways that could be difficult to deal with. Similarly, proportional representation could bring about greater representation, but may be so complex to administer you could end up with. But anyway, important to have that discussion around the rules. I think Leo's question on legitimacy, if you look at the democracy and development literature and that debate, that's essential to the question, you know, which comes first and what provides legitimacy? Is it democracy or is it development? And certainly in the Asian context, the questions around performance legitimacy, i.e. economic performance, delivers legitimacy, not electoral performance or political performance, but what kind of development are you bringing to the citizens? Those are questions that I think are still being hammered out, and you can see some reversals on democracy potentially in Indonesia coming up with the presidential elections this year, when people are feeling there's been a failure of economic delivery by the democratic system and are looking to a more authoritarian president to potentially take over to deliver this kind of stable economic performance. So that would be an election to watch on that point. So I wasn't meaning to imply that democracy and legitimacy necessarily come together. There's a big discussion around that. But there seems to be a kind of agreement among the donors, at least at the moment, although some may disagree on this, that you need democracy to deliver development, but the literature doesn't agree on that.
Maybe if you address one or two more
Okay.
comments. So we can
Yeah. Just to answer the question on Mansfield and Snyder, the data set that they use stops in the 1980s. So I think that lots of the conflicts that we've seen since the end of the Cold War are not included within their data set, because those are the sort of more civil war, communal conflict, ethno-religious violence type scenarios. But I think their theory around elites and nationalism and what kind of institutions you need to have in place for there not to be an escalation towards violence during competitive elections can still hold a lot of relevance. even though they would themselves admit that their data set doesn't include lots of those kind of cases. I know they're discussing the likelihood of war, but I still think you can use some of the theory in a useful way. And then on gender, I think the unfortunate thing is obviously that competitive elections don't necessarily bring about greater gender inclusion. And, you know, Egypt and Indonesia offer very good examples of the problems for both minorities and women when it comes to competitive elections. And women's representation in both parliaments has gone down since democratization's been introduced. So there has to be careful consideration about other forms of representation or inclusion of women in countries where a competitive election will deliver exclusion of women rather than inclusion. And perhaps that's what, George, you were alluding to in the notion that elections are very blunt instruments and don't deliver what, you know, people imagine the tin says that they will produce, and that they can only be part of a whole package of complementary or more subtle tools for inclusion, representation, and the participation of previously excluded groups.
Thank you, Claire. David, may I turn to you?
I'm also going to try and do all of them. Okay, ideologies, no. There are cross-cutting themes, but ideologies, no. Conflict, it's interesting in particularly in the case of Sierra Leone, and this is kind of counterintuitive, that conflict at election time has actually increased since the end of the war. Now, why that is the case, although in the last election in Sierra Leone it wasn't, so it is variable. It could be to do with the competitiveness of those particular elections, because the ones that just happened the year before last, were not particularly competitive, because it looked like the ruling party was going to win it from a very early stage. So yes, conflict continues to be, or violence continues to be a problem around elections, particularly in Sierra Leone, but also in Liberia. I don't think that answers the question, but anyway. The patrimonial elite, I think maybe we're misrepresenting patrimonialism a bit here. When we say representing people's interests, people are involved in the patrimonial process. They're at the other end. And so when we talk about people benefiting from the electoral process, well, the idea is, within a patrimonial process, that you vote for those people you think are going to bring the stuff back home to your community. So it's a two-way process. Yes, of course, it's biased towards the top, but this is people's interest. This is what they want to see. They want to see the bread and butter coming back to their community. So I would go against a little bit what George says about well, at least in my sphere of interest, the patrimonial elite. Yes, it does have its own interests, but it also has to have interests in its own community. Otherwise, it will not get these votes, and it will be voted out next time. So it will lose legitimacy. And that, I guess, going to your question about legitimacy, is that if you look at the whole history of post-colonial Africa, you'll see that legitimacy is often based, not always entirely, but to some degree, on that patrimonial exchange, whether it's authoritarian, whether it's military, whether it's socialist, whether it's electoral democracy. So I agree with you entirely that legitimacy is more of a fundamental rather than democracy. Democracy is a kind of one way of delivering legitimacy, absolutely. And it's interesting that that way of delivering, the way that legitimacy works has only changed incrementally in Africa, not to the extent that regime type has changed. Development, if democracy doesn't deliver development, yes, that's a problem. South-South, it's quite interesting. I've been involved in a project looking at Indian engagements in Africa, and they're very keen on electoral training and such like, so that's one worth watching. Okay, election rules. I would suggest that PR and decentralization don't actually make that much difference. I think you'd have to go for something a bit more radical. Consociationalism is a possibility, But I think also that someone needs to start thinking through how you take the state-society relations in Africa and you make them work in a democratic national process. Now, so this has been thought through by some people, not entirely convincingly. It has been tried in the case of Museveni in Uganda, in the case of the local elections in Ghana, which are non-partisan, in the case, well, even Babangida in Nigeria in the early 1990s, who set up two parties and gave them their ideologies. These things, you know, I think I'd be with you on this one. I'd say, yes, let's consider those. That actually takes me to your comment, which was that the Western interventions delivers democracy. Well, yes, but it delivers a certain type of democracy, and that may be part of the problem. Maybe it needs to be a think through of what sort of democracy is being delivered here. Now, arguably as well, there is now, after sort of 25 years since the end of the Cold War, there is a groundswell of opinion in Africa which wants to keep democracy. But what is this sort of democracy? So I think we've got away from the sort of imposition of democracy. Now it's kind of embedded, but it begs the question of what sort of democracy we want. Gender roles. Women, of course, are underrepresented in both of these cases. There was a big hoo-ha internationally about Ellen Johnson Sirleaf being elected. I think, personally, that Johnson Sirleaf was not elected because she was a woman. Far from it. She was elected because she did all the patronage stuff, the ethno-regional stuff, and she also presented that educated image rather than George Weah, who presented a kind of populist image, and the Liberians bought into that. I think the number of women that voted for her because she was a woman was minute. So I don't think that's changed. I think it continues to be, women continue to be underrepresented. And I frankly rail against some of this stuff that comes out in the West. There was a film made, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, which is a terrible representation of women in Liberia. It's on this idea, it's a Western idea of what women do. Media, no. I don't think the Sierra Leone and Liberian media at the central level actually makes much difference. At a local community level, amongst on the radios, yes, I would say that it does make some difference. Yeah, that's it.
Good run around all of the questions. Lisa, did you want to add some further thoughts?
I might just pick up quickly on the gender point, relating it to Sierra Leone. So interestingly, the 2012 election that Dave mentioned, where there was sort of not that much competition. Part of the reason there wasn't much competition is because the SLPP opposition put forward a guy as their candidate who'd been involved in 2 coups in the past. Now, interestingly, his running mate was a woman who everybody thought was actually really good and probably should have been the leader, or put forward as the leader, but because there was a sense of a woman, no one will elect a woman, she wasn't put in that role. But the only other interesting thing, I think, is that in, I think it was the 2007 elections, they tried to bring in some sort of gender-friendly election practices. So, for instance, in terms of election queues, they created queues separate for women who had babies and kids with them so that they could vote much faster. And it seems to me, I mean, I know it's never a problem I've voted in the UK and I'm astonished how few people turn up, but coming from a country where we have compulsory voting, actually I would love a queue for just the women, for instance. And I think all the innovations in these kinds of practices are going to be happening in countries where a lot of people vote, which is going to be, developing countries rather than most of the West.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for perhaps one very quick zip around the room one more time. Just to take advantage of the fact that I'm holding this right in front of me. ODI did some interesting work on electoral systems, to go back to Patty's question, and I think there, the same picture that emerges about elections comes across very clearly, which is you will never find a perfect election, and you will probably never find a perfect electoral system to fit the different conditions, and there will always be some trade-offs involved. I think this question about legitimacy and where it comes from and whether and how performance matters is perhaps the leading challenge that emerging democracies face in the 21st century, and this is even much more accentuated in post-conflict settings. Now, just to ask something quickly to the panel, if I may. I wonder, based on the reflections that you guys have shared with us, I wonder if it is possible to think through whether and how elections have been able to expound the boundaries of the political settlement in place in these different settings that you have experienced with. And we have some contrasting views between George and David about whether or not they have helped to build legitimacy and to be inclusive. But I wonder if we take a sort of a longer horizon perspective, not just looking at an immediate election, but elections sort of as processes that build over time and with their repetition. Can we see that, for example, in either Cambodia or Timor or the other countries that we have talked about, the elite understandings have been broadened and more people have been included as a result of electoral processes, or that has that not happened? Maybe, yes, the lady in the back there has.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Marijke Shamiros from the London School of Economics. One of the things that I find quite troubling is that legitimacy is used as a noun, because rather than a state that sort of emerges, and I compare this primarily to the Sudanese elections, which of course happened before the country split into two. Legitimizing is very much an active verb, and it's bestowed. There's really agency involved, and I think what we've not heard so much, and I would really like some reflections from the panel, is the role of an international community that pushes towards elections, and then afterwards also judges whether these legitimized or not. And what we've seen in maybe the Republic of Sudan, but certainly in South Sudan, is exactly this process, where the elections were very much pushed for, they went through, they were really quite appalling, but they were also then very much legitimized after the fact by a whole range of international observation missions. And for full disclosure, I worked on one of these. And of course, what we now have is a big problem in South Sudan, where you have a government that was, if you look at all the election reports of the observation missions report of from the time, was legitimately elected, but actually now behaves really rather problematically. And I was just wondering whether you have seen in any of the experiences that actually this act of legitimizing isn't at all something that sort of emerges from within, but is very much bestowed from the outside. Thank you.
I think I will allow one more question and then give 1 minute each to the panelists. So I have to. It's terrible. I will give the last word to the lady there. In terms of questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Karina Scoffier from DFID. My question is very similar to the one that's just come. Maybe I had a rather complicated question that started with a bit of a comment, but I'll make it very simple. Should the international community, should donors support elections? And if you could talk maybe to the technical, but also to the political. Do we have a role, if we do have a role in supporting elections, then do we have a role in sort of what then ensues? So I'm thinking about the elections in Afghanistan. Perhaps George has some thoughts. Right now, we're in the midst of it. Does the international community have a role in terms of brokering a solution when the two parties involved are not able to agree on the outcome? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really sorry that we cannot invite further questions, but I will now give about 1 to 2 minutes to each of the panelists to be able to respond to the last few questions that come up. So Lisa has seated her place very kindly. So
okay. Changes to. Can you just rephrase your first question? Your only question.
I'm wondering if the electoral process or elections enable, in a way, the political system to become more open over time, so that actually power becomes more broadly shared. We were talking about this neo-patrimonial tendency, but does that, and the democratizing effects that corruption may have, so does that mean that more people eventually and over time, this doesn't happen with one election, right? But over time, can we see enough change, for example, in Liberia or Sierra Leone, to say, actually, through the electoral process, more people have become empowered, and the power elites have become broader, let's say, or not?
I think it depends what time you're talking about and where you go. And I think these things go forward and they come back and then they go forward. I think from 2005 and indeed even in 2011 in Liberia, you have got quite a broad representation in government. I think that's come from that's very specific environment. I think I would have to say that it ebbs and flows. It comes and goes, depending on the circumstances. If this means that is it changing from a more patronage-based notion of legitimacy to a more performance-based notion of legitimacy? I don't see that happening at the moment in Sierra Leone and Liberia. I don't really see it happening in many other places in Africa just yet. That's not to say that it isn't one of the factors that people consider, because of course you do get fluctuations in how people vote. Many people will vote on ethno-regional blocks, but there will be sometimes, there are certainly floating ethnic groups. There are also those who will shift if they consider that a government has actually built the roads and built the hospitals. So I don't want to rule out the notion that there is some sort of performance-driven idea, and particularly in the cities, that would be the case. But I don't want to exaggerate it either, far from it. Legitimizing by internationals. I've worked on several election monitoring circuses myself. What can I say? Yeah, it's problematic sometimes, and other times it's not. I would still say that legitimacy is mainly driven internally, rather than by those the reports that come out, although of course they do have an influence. I'm sorry, that's a very swift answer. Donors supporting elections. I think there are ways in which donors can support elections, and ways in which they may be barking up the wrong tree. So I would suggest that supporting election commissions is probably a good idea, so that you get some sort of institution which can be as independent and as resourced as possible. I think actually financing political parties is probably a good idea. I know this is not particularly popular, but I think it's probably a good idea. A, so that you get that military to political transition, and B, so that you can somehow level that playing field and make incumbency not so important. However, I don't think that I don't think many of the efforts to make accountability and representation more liberal in basis, building up civil society, building up women's participation, I don't think that those are having the effects that are wanted. I would probably argue that to shift towards funding political parties and funding, and commissions are already funded, but the idea of changing the way that people, the way that political parties campaign and the way that people react to those campaigns, I don't think is, in other words, injecting liberalism, I don't think is going to work terribly well. Yeah.
Thank you. Claire.
I think I can try to address Marika's question and the question from Diffid hopefully together. Whether donors should support elections without supporting political party strengthening, which David just alluded to, or without supporting the processes that go around democratization, whether that's other forms of inclusion, or particularly something we haven't focused on that much, which is democratic literacy, what it means for people to participate in an election more broadly, not just voting, but what it means in terms of accountability and holding people accountable and how you do that, and participating across the system as a whole. But because people don't seem to want to support parties anymore, you end up with very vague, opaque, and rather shallow democracies. Democracies evolve around party organisations. Parties are the vehicle that reconnects state and society, or that brings people into play with the state. Without those sorts of organisations, it's difficult to see how democracies function. And so I think party support, however untrendy it is at the moment, is something that has to be brought back into the discussion. because legitimacy, as you say, is a verb, not only a noun, and legitimizing purely a number, so many people voted for this person or not this person, doesn't bring about a full picture of what political change or transformation possibly could be. And on the question of the political settlement, I think the issue is whether the political settlement's already been established. But if it hasn't, and many countries don't have a political settlement agreed upon before they have an election, so that's problematic because you have elections going on in a system that hasn't determined what the political order of that state already is. And the second part to the answer there is how long is over time? Because as we've seen with Silas's presentation in Cambodia, the CPP's dominated politics for 30 years almost, and it's only the cracks are only beginning to show now. Over time, people are realizing they can maybe get rid of CPP through elections, but that's taken 30 years to kind of come about for people to understand that they can use elections to their advantage, not just to keep voting in the major patron. And over time in Timor, you've probably seen, it's only been 15 years since they've got independence, you probably, if that even, you've probably seen political inclusion shrinking, not growing. But it's only been 10, 15 years. It may need more time for there to be a greater inclusion. Maybe the elite's narrowing down at the moment and then may take some more time to become more expansive. But that time question kind of comes up again and again.
Thank you very much. Simon.
Well, it's been a long day, so I hope I can respond coherently to some of these. The issue of the CPP, I just, my sense is that, and just to pick up on Claire's point, that its change is potential to happen through the elections. However, most people actually just want the CPP to change. They're not necessarily, it's not clear as to whether or not people want the CPP out. So I hope we can clarify that. And also just on the issue of corruption, I think, just to go back to an earlier point that's made, I wasn't saying that corruption's okay. I'm just saying that there's a value of it in establishing political order and stability and whatnot. There's an actual, there's a value for it. So this question of whether and how elections can expand the political settlement, I think Timor presents a really interesting case because in 2001, for the Constituent Assembly election, the imposition of the elections themselves at a time when Shanana Guzmão, who was essentially the rebel leader, wasn't able to form his own political party. At that time, the party structure from Fretlin dominated. Fretlin got into power. Fretlin was not able to hold the political settlement, a very loose, weak political settlement together. The 2006 crisis happened, and Shanana Guzmão stepped back in with CNRT and was able to restore order, dealt with Alfredo Renato. He got the IDPs back out and resettled and all the rest. So those elections were important, actually, very important in sort of expanding the political settlement, because essentially the proceeds from the oil resources, Shanana spread those much wider through procurement and other things that brought a lot of people in that were otherwise marginalized under the Fretlin government, I would argue. I would just say one thing is on the issue of whether on the election sort of being only game in town or whatnot, that, I mean, undemocratic governments aren't very friendly. I think we just have to think about the governments in a way that we're, in one way or another, whether we come from a society that has the values or we're working under funding from governments that carry the values. I just want to point out that we do take forward a set of values, and our national interests do play a role, and I just want to make sure that that's out on the table. I'm not, again, justifying that. I just think that that's something that's just a practical consideration in this. And I would just say maybe in terms of the international role in pushing elections, that just, I think it's a really interesting idea of sort of the democratization of the process of choosing a political order in early, state formation stage, and how that would actually look like, and how that could be carried out. I think that's really interesting. So I don't have anything really more to say. Thanks.
Thank you. And George?
I do think that elections contribute, particularly in sort of offering a publicly sanctioned way of maturing political parties. They have to go through a process of engagement, not only within their own constituencies, but also appeal to other constituencies. In doing so, they engage in a process of dialogue and negotiation, either consciously or otherwise. And I think if Nepal hadn't had a delay in sort of this constitution writing process, I think we would have had a flawed constitution, for example. So just saying that the opportunity of another election has caused the prominent political parties to have to renegotiate with their constituencies. So the Maoist party, as you know, came to power with overwhelming numbers, and now is suddenly relegated to third. And a lot of their cadre have either been lost to them through migration to Qatar or to other parties. So in that sense, I think elections are also quite important. I didn't mean to imply that the elite politicians somehow get into power and stay in power without the benefit of being voted into power by their constituencies. All I'm saying is those constituencies and those elites are so narrowly focused in the early years that we must be careful about that, and we must invest in understanding that behavior that tends to keep them focused like that. And I dare say that investments in development in places like Afghanistan actually incentivize them to remain narrow in many ways, because there are relationships of loyalty and patronage with the international development community that causes that perverse effect. And for those reasons, I think continued international assistance to elections are important. But again, it must be elections plus, and I don't think you can abdicate that responsibility where you simply say we supported a very wide sort of campaign in election education, voter education, and somehow the election commission is now capable. Beyond all of that, if we acknowledge that the initial elections are not truly representative of citizen preferences and voice, then there must be other means to do that in the 8 to 12 years after a settlement that a nation must go through to sort of come to some stability.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists for really a truly excellent discussion on a very important and quite present issue. So please, can I give a round of applause to everybody?